The autumn wind howled through the bare branches of Salem's ancient oaks as Sarah Mitchell stood before the imposing wrought iron gates of Wycliffe Manor. The October sky hung heavy with storm clouds, casting an ominous pallor over the sprawling, Gothic estate that had remained untouched for nearly 3 decades. As a historical researcher specializing in colonial American families, Sarah had encountered her share of mysterious legacies, but nothing had prepared her for the Wycliffe inheritance. "Are you certain you want to proceed with this, Miss Mitchell?" asked Thomas Hartwell, the elderly estate attorney who had contacted her 6 months prior. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the ornate brass keys. The previous researchers... Well, they didn't complete their work. Sarah adjusted her leather satchel and pulled her wool coat tighter against the biting wind. "Mr. Hartwell, I've spent my entire career documenting the histories of New England's founding families. The Wycliffes may have their secrets, but every family does. I'm not easily deterred by local superstitions." The attorney's pale blue eyes reflected a mixture of admiration and concern. "It's not superstition I'm worried about, Miss Mitchell. It's the documented facts. 7 researchers have attempted to catalog the Wycliffe archives over the past 50 years. 3 abandoned the project without explanation. 2 suffered complete nervous breakdowns, and 2..." He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 2 simply vanished. As the massive gates creaked open, revealing a winding cobblestone path lined with gnarled elm trees, Sarah felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. The manor itself loomed before them like a monument to Gothic excess, 3 stories of dark stone and timber, with towering spires that seemed to pierce the gray sky. Gargoyles perched along the roofline, their stone faces twisted into expressions of eternal anguish. The Wycliffe family arrived in Salem in 1692. Sarah recited from her research notes, attempting to maintain her professional composure. Ezekiel Wycliffe claimed to be a merchant from London, but there are no records of his existence in England prior to his arrival. Within 5 years, he had amassed considerable wealth and influence, becoming one of Salem's most prominent citizens. Thomas nodded grimly. "Yes, and that's where the strangeness begins." Ezekiel's rise to power coincided with a series of unexplained deaths among his business rivals. Nothing that could be proven, of course, but the pattern was disturbing. They approached the manor's main entrance, where massive oak doors bore the Wycliffe family crest, a twisted tree with roots that seemed to writhe like serpents, crowned by a raven with outstretched wings. The brass knocker was fashioned in the shape of a human skull, its hollow eye socket seeming to follow their movement. "The family maintained their prominence for over 3 centuries, Sarah continued, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. They were involved in shipping, textiles, and later, steel production. Yet despite their wealth and influence, they remained remarkably reclusive. Very few photographs exist of family members, and public records are surprisingly sparse." As Thomas inserted the key into the ancient lock, the door swung open with a prolonged groan that echoed through the interior. The entrance hall was vast and dimly lit, with a grand staircase that curved upward into shadows. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through stained glass windows, and the air carried the musty scent of decades of abandonment, mixed with something else, something that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of old incense and dried herbs. "The last known Wycliffe was Mortimer Wycliffe, who died in 1994, Thomas explained as they stepped inside. "He was found in his study, apparently of natural causes. Though the circumstances were peculiar, he was discovered seated at his desk, pen in hand, as if he had been writing. But the paper before him was blank, and his eyes..." The attorney shuddered. His eyes were completely white, as if he had been staring into some terrible light. Sarah's professional skepticism warred with a growing sense of unease as she surveyed the interior. The walls were lined with portraits of Wycliffe ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to track her movement through the hall. Each face bore a striking resemblance to the others: sharp, aristocratic features, pale skin, and eyes that held an unsettling intensity. "Where are the family archives located?" she asked, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "The library is on the second floor," Thomas replied, gesturing toward the staircase. "But Miss Mitchell, I must warn you, the previous researchers all reported experiences, strange sounds, unexplained cold spots, and some claimed to see figures moving through the halls at night." Sarah forced a confident smile. "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate your concern, but I'm here to do a job. The Wycliffe Historical Society has commissioned me to create a comprehensive family history, and that's exactly what I intend to do. Whatever happened to the previous researchers, I'm sure there's a rational explanation." As they climbed the stairs, the wooden steps creaked ominously beneath their feet. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions, lined with more portraits and illuminated by flickering electric sconces that cast dancing shadows on the walls. At the far end of the corridor, massive double doors stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of towering bookshelves within. "The library contains over 10,000 volumes," Thomas explained as they approached. "Many are first editions, some dating back to the 1600s. The family papers are housed in the archives room adjacent to the library. Everything you need should be there." As Sarah pushed open the library doors, she was struck by the sheer magnitude of the collection. The room was enormous, with shelves reaching from floor to ceiling on all four walls. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with strange symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the room sat an ornate reading table, its surface scarred with what appeared to be burn marks arranged in intricate patterns. "I'll leave you to your work," Thomas said, backing toward the door. "I'll return tomorrow evening to check on your progress. Please, Miss Mitchell, if you experience anything unusual, don't hesitate to contact me immediately." After the attorney's footsteps faded down the hallway, Sarah found herself alone in the vast library. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling and the distant whisper of wind through the eaves. She approached the archives room, a smaller chamber connected to the library, where dozens of filing cabinets and document boxes awaited her attention. As she opened the first box, labeled Ezekiel Wycliffe, Personal Correspondence, Sarah discovered that her real work was just beginning. The documents within were written in various hands, some in English, others in what appeared to be Latin, and still others in symbols she didn't recognize. But it was the content of the first letter she read that made her blood run cold. The letter, dated 1697, was addressed to someone called the Keeper of the Ancient Ways, and spoke of a covenant sealed in blood and services rendered in exchange for earthly dominion. As Sarah read further, she realized she had stumbled upon something far more sinister than a simple family history. The Wycliffes, it seemed, had indeed made a pact, but not with any earthly power. Sarah spent her first night in the manor's guest quarters, a surprisingly comfortable suite on the third floor that had been prepared for visiting researchers. Despite her exhaustion from traveling and the emotional weight of her initial discoveries, sleep eluded her. Every creak of the old building, every whisper of wind through the corridors, seemed to carry an ominous significance. She had managed to translate several more of Ezekiel Wycliffe's letters before retiring, and each revelation had been more disturbing than the last. The family patriarch hadn't simply been a successful merchant. He had been a practitioner of what he called the old arts, and his correspondence suggested a network of like-minded individuals throughout colonial New England. Dawn broke gray and cheerless over Salem, and Sarah returned to the library with renewed determination. She had arranged the translated documents in chronological order, and a disturbing pattern was beginning to emerge. The Wycliffe family's rise to prominence had indeed been meteoric, but it had come at a terrible cost. October 15th, 1698, she read aloud from Ezekiel's journal, her voice echoing in the empty library. The harvest moon approaches, and with it, the time of renewal. The keeper has been most generous in his guidance, but the price grows ever steeper. Young Nathaniel shows promise in the arts, though his mother continues to resist. She will learn, as they all must, that our family's destiny is not to be denied. Sarah paused, consulting her genealogical charts. Nathaniel would have been Ezekiel's eldest son, born in 1685. According to the family records, he had died in 1699 at the age of 14, officially from consumption, but the timing seemed suspiciously coincidental. She turned to a leather-bound ledger that appeared to be some sort of accounting book, but instead of financial transactions, it recorded what Ezekiel called offerings and returns. The entries were cryptic but disturbing. November 1st, 1698. Offered, the Blackwood infant, taken during the fever. Returned, safe passage for 3 ships through the winter storms. Profit, £2,000 sterling. December 21st, 1698. Offered, the widow Prescott, taken during the solstice ritual. Returned, the Henderson contract secured. Profit, £5,000 sterling. Sarah's hands trembled as she read entry after entry, each one documenting what appeared to be human sacrifices in exchange for business success. The implications were staggering, if these records were accurate. The Wycliffe family had built their fortune on murder and dark magic. A sudden sound from the hallway made her look up from the documents. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, were approaching the library. But Thomas Hartwell wasn't due to return until evening, and she was certain she had locked the front door. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely steady. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped directly outside the library doors. Sarah held her breath, straining to hear any sound, but the silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she gathered her courage and approached the doors, pressing her ear against the wood. Nothing. She slowly opened one of the doors and peered into the hallway. It was empty, but she could have sworn she detected the faint scent of sulfur lingering in the air. Shaking her head, she returned to her work, attributing the incident to the stress of her discoveries and the oppressive atmosphere of the old manor. The next document she examined was a letter from Nathaniel Wycliffe, dated just weeks before his death. Unlike his father's confident, commanding tone, Nathaniel's writing was shaky and desperate. "Father, I cannot continue with the rituals. The things I have seen, the voices that speak to me in the darkness, they are not of God's creation. Mother was right to fear what we have become. The keeper promises power and wealth, but at what cost? I have seen the faces of those we have offered, and they haunt my dreams. Please, I beg you, release me from this covenant before it claims my soul as well." Ezekiel's response, written in his characteristic bold script, was chilling in its callousness. "My son, you speak of souls as if they were possessions to be bartered. We are Wycliffes, and our destiny was sealed long before your birth. The keeper has shown me visions of our family's future, generations of power and influence, wealth beyond imagination, dominion over lesser men. Your temporary discomfort is a small price to pay for such glory. You will participate in the Samhain ritual, or you will be replaced by one more worthy of our name." Sarah realized she was looking at the last correspondence between father and son. Nathaniel had died 3 days after the date of his father's letter, during what would have been the Samhain ritual Ezekiel had mentioned. As she continued reading, she discovered that Nathaniel's death had not ended the family's involvement in the dark arts. His younger brother, Josiah, had taken his place in the rituals, and the pattern had continued for generations. Each eldest son was initiated into the family's secrets, and those who refused to participate met mysterious ends. The afternoon light filtering through the library windows began to fade, and Sarah realized she had been reading for hours without a break. Her eyes burned from deciphering the archaic handwriting, and her mind reeled from the horrific revelations. She decided to take a brief walk through the manor to clear her head and stretch her legs. The second-floor hallway seemed different in the late afternoon light. The portraits that had appeared merely stern in the morning now seemed actively malevolent, their painted eyes following her movement with unmistakable hostility. She paused before a portrait of a man she recognized from the documents, Josiah Wycliffe, Ezekiel's second son and heir. The painting depicted a man in his 30s, dressed in the fashion of the early 1700s. His face bore the characteristic Wycliffe features, sharp cheekbones, pale skin, and those unsettling eyes. But there was something else in his expression, something that made Sarah's skin crawl. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, done too much, and had lost whatever humanity he might once have possessed. "You know our secrets now," a voice whispered behind her. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but the hallway was empty. The voice had been so clear, so close, that she could have sworn someone was standing directly behind her. She backed against the wall, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice echoing through the corridor. "Show yourself." Only silence answered her, but the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah's breath began to form small clouds, and she could feel goosebumps rising on her arms despite her warm sweater. She hurried back to the library, her footsteps echoing loudly in the oppressive quiet. Once inside, she locked the doors behind her and returned to the reading table, but her concentration was shattered. The voice had been so real, so immediate, that she couldn't dismiss it as imagination or stress. As evening approached, Sarah found herself dreading the arrival of darkness. The manor seemed to come alive after sunset, filled with sounds that had no apparent source, footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing, and occasionally what sounded like whispered conversations in languages she didn't recognize. She was examining a collection of photographs from the late 1800s when she made another disturbing discovery. The images showed various Wycliffe family gatherings, but in several of the photographs, there were additional figures, shadowy forms that seemed to hover at the edges of the frame. At first, she thought they might be photographic artifacts or double exposures, but the more she studied them, the more convinced she became that they were intentional inclusions. One photograph in particular caught her attention. It showed the entire Wycliffe family circa 1885, posed in front of the manor's main entrance. But standing behind the family patriarch was a tall, thin figure dressed in dark robes, its face obscured by shadow. What was most disturbing was that the figure cast no shadow of its own, despite the bright sunlight evident in the rest of the photograph. As Sarah studied the image more closely, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The robed figure's hands, barely visible at the edges of its sleeves, appeared to be resting on the shoulders of two young children in the photograph. According to her genealogical research, both of those children had died within a year of the photograph being taken. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the manor, followed by Thomas Hartwell's voice calling her name. Sarah quickly gathered the most significant documents and photographs, securing them in her satchel. She had found far more than she had bargained for, and she was beginning to understand why so many previous researchers had abandoned their work. But as she prepared to meet with the attorney, Sarah realized that she was no longer just documenting a family history. She was uncovering evidence of crimes that spanned centuries, and the perpetrators, or their supernatural allies, might not appreciate her discoveries. The Wycliffe legacy was far-off. Thomas Hartwell's face grew increasingly pale as Sarah shared her discoveries from the day's research. They sat in the manor's formal dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a massive mahogany table that could easily seat 20 people. Walls were lined with more Wycliffe portraits, their subjects seeming to lean forward in their frames, as if straining to hear every word of their conversation. "Miss Mitchell, I must insist that you consider abandoning this project," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What you're describing, it's not just family history. It's evidence of systematic murder spanning 3 centuries. Sarah spread the translated documents across the table, her academic training warring with her growing fear. "Mr. Hartwell, I understand your concern, but these documents need to be studied by proper authorities. If even half of what's recorded here is true, we're looking at one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in American history." The attorney's hands shook as he examined Ezekiel's ledger. "The previous researchers. Now I understand what drove them away. Dr. Margaret Thornton, the historian who attempted this project in 1987, left behind only a single note: the dead. Do not rest easy in this place. We found her research materials scattered throughout the library, as if she had fled in the middle of her work." A sudden gust of wind rattled the dining room windows, and the electric lights flickered ominously. Both Sarah and Thomas looked up at the ornate chandelier hanging above the table, its crystal pendants chiming softly in the disturbed air. "There's something else," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "I've been experiencing ... phenomena. Voices, footsteps, sudden temperature drops. I know how it sounds, but I'm not prone to hallucinations or flights of fancy." Thomas nodded grimly. "You're not the first to report such experiences. Dr. Thornton mentioned similar occurrences in her preliminary notes. She claimed to have seen figures moving through the halls at night, and she reported finding fresh flowers on graves that had been empty the day before." "Graves?" Sarah asked, her interest piqued despite her fear. "The family cemetery is located behind the manor in a grove of ancient oaks. It's been sealed since Mortimer's death, but the groundskeeper reported strange lights emanating from the area on several occasions before he quit his position." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "I need to see those graves. If the family was involved in ritual murder, there might be evidence of additional burials, victims who were never officially recorded." "Absolutely not," Thomas said firmly. "Miss Mitchell, I've already lost sleep over allowing you to continue this research. I won't be responsible for you wandering around a potentially dangerous cemetery in the dark." Their conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze: the distinct melody of a music box playing somewhere in the upper floors of the manor. The tune was hauntingly beautiful but deeply melancholy, and it seemed to drift down through the ceiling like a ghostly lament. "That's impossible," Thomas whispered. "The manor has been without power to the upper floors for months. We only restored electricity to the first 2 floors for your research." The music continued for several minutes before gradually fading away, leaving them in an oppressive silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. Sarah realized that her hands were trembling, and she clasped them together to steady herself. "Mr. Hartwell, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. What really happened to the researchers who disappeared?" The attorney was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with guilt and fear. "Dr. James Whitmore vanished in 1962. He had been working here for 3 weeks, making excellent progress on cataloging the family archives. His assistant found his research materials neatly arranged in the library, but Dr. Whitmore was nowhere to be found. His car was still in the driveway, his personal belongings were still in his room, but he had simply ... vanished." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. "And the other one?" "Professor Elena Vasquez, in 1978. She was a specialist in colonial American occultism, brought in specifically because of some of the strange materials in the Wycliffe collection. She had been here for 2 weeks when the groundskeeper found her research notes scattered across the cemetery. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of where she had gone. The police investigation turned up nothing. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Sarah realized that she might be walking in the footsteps of people who had paid the ultimate price for their curiosity about the Wycliffe family secrets. "There's more," Thomas continued reluctantly. Both Dr. Whitmore and Professor Vasquez had made significant discoveries before their disappearances. According to their notes, they had found evidence that the Wycliffe family's supernatural activities didn't end with the colonial period. The rituals, the sacrifices, the pacts with otherworldly entities, it all continued well into the modern era. Sarah thought about the photographs she had examined, particularly the one showing the shadowy figure standing behind the 1885 family gathering. "The entity in the photographs, do you think it's still active?" Before Thomas could answer, the lights in the dining room went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps directly above them, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth across the floor of the room overhead. "Stay calm," Thomas whispered, fumbling for his phone's flashlight. "The electrical system in this old place is unreliable." But Sarah knew this wasn't a simple power failure. The temperature in the room had dropped dramatically, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the beam of Thomas's phone light. More disturbing still, the footsteps above them had been joined by what sounded like voices, multiple. People engaged in conversation, though the words were indistinct. "We need to leave," Sarah said, gathering her documents. "Now." As they made their way toward the dining room door, the voices above them grew louder and more distinct. Sarah could make out what sounded like chanting in a language she didn't recognize, punctuated by occasional words in archaic English. The rhythm was hypnotic and deeply unsettling, like a perverted version of a religious ceremony. They reached the front door without incident, but as Thomas fumbled with the locks, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. Among the chanting voices, she could clearly distinguish a woman's voice calling for help, not in the archaic language of the others, but in modern English, desperate and terrified. "Please," the voice cried out, "someone help me. I can't find my way out. The shadows, they won't let me leave." Sarah grabbed Thomas's arm. "Did you hear that? There's someone upstairs who needs help." The attorney's face was ashen in the phone's light. "Miss Mitchell, there's no one in this building but us. The manor has been empty for 30 years. But the voice continued, growing more desperate and panicked. "My name is Alina Vasquez. I'm a professor at Boston University. I came here to research the Wycliffe family, but something's gone wrong. The rituals ... they're still happening. The dead are still here, and they won't let me leave." Sarah felt the world tilt around her as she realized what she was hearing. Professor Vasquez, the researcher who had disappeared in 1978, was still in the manor, trapped somehow between life and death, a prisoner of the same dark forces she had come to study. "We have to help her," Sarah said, starting toward the staircase. Thomas grabbed her arm. "No. Whatever's happening here, we're not equipped to deal with it. We need to contact the authorities, bring in experts who understand this kind of ... phenomenon." The chanting above them reached a crescendo, and suddenly the lights throughout the manor blazed back to life. The voices fell silent, and the oppressive cold began to dissipate. But Sarah knew that whatever had just occurred was far from over. As they finally made it outside into the cool October night, Sarah looked back at the manor's illuminated windows. In several of them, she could see silhouettes, figures standing motionless, watching their departure. She counted at least 6 distinct shapes, and she realized with growing horror that she might be looking at all the researchers who had come before her, trapped forever in the Wycliffe family's supernatural web. "Mr. Hartwell," she said as they reached his car, "I'm not abandoning this research, but I'm going to need help, real help. Do you know anyone who specializes in unusual phenomena?" The attorney nodded slowly. "There's a man in Boston, Dr. Marcus Blackwood. He's a professor of comparative religion at Harvard, but he also investigates claims of supernatural activity. If anyone can help us understand what's happening here, it's him. As they drove away from Wycliffe Manor, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling to hate. Dr. Marcus Blackwood arrived at Wycliffe Manor on a gray Thursday morning, his presence immediately commanding attention despite his unassuming appearance. A tall, lean man in his 50s with prematurely silver hair and penetrating green eyes. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the inexplicable and lived to document it. Sarah met him at the manor's entrance, grateful to have an ally who didn't dismiss her experiences as imagination or stress. She had spent the previous 2 days researching Dr. Blackwood's background and had been impressed by his credentials. Not only was he a respected academic, but he had also consulted on several high-profile cases involving alleged supernatural phenomena. "Miss Mitchell," Dr. Blackwood said, extending his hand in greeting. "Thomas Hartwell has briefed me on your discoveries. I must say, the Wycliffe case represents one of the most extensive documented examples of generational occult practice I've encountered in 30 years of research." They were joined by Thomas Hartwell and a woman Sarah hadn't expected, Dr. Rebecca Chun, a forensic anthropologist from Boston University. Dr. Chun was a compact, energetic woman in her 40s with short black hair and an expression of intense curiosity. Dr. Chun specializes in historical crime scenes, Dr. Blackwood explained. If the Wycliffe family was indeed involved in ritual murder over multiple centuries, we'll need someone who can identify and properly document any physical evidence. Sarah led the group into the library, where she had organized her translated documents and photographs into a comprehensive timeline. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to diminish the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued her solitary research, but she could still feel the weight of unseen eyes watching their every movement. "The pattern is remarkably consistent," Sarah explained, spreading the documents across the reading table. Each generation of Wycliffes maintained the family's supernatural practices, with the eldest son serving as the primary practitioner. Those who refused to participate died under mysterious circumstances, and their younger siblings took their place. Dr. Blackwood examined Ezekiel's original correspondence with keen interest. The entity referred to as the Keeper appears to be some form of demonic patron, a powerful supernatural being that provides worldly benefits in exchange for regular offerings and absolute loyalty. This type of generational pact is extremely rare, but not unheard of in occult literature. Dr. Chen was studying the photographs with a magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the shadowy figures that appeared in several images. "These aren't photographic artifacts," she said definitively. "The positioning and consistency across multiple photographs suggests intentional inclusion. Someone wanted these entities to be documented." "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been hearing voices, specifically the voice of Professor Elena Vasquez, the researcher who disappeared in 1978. She seems to be trapped somewhere in the manor, along with possibly other missing researchers." Dr. Blackwood nodded grimly. Spiritual imprisonment is a common consequence of interfering with established occult practices. If Professor Vasquez and the others stumbled upon active supernatural forces, they may have been absorbed into the manor's psychic structure as a form of protection for the family's secrets. Thomas Hartwell, who had been unusually quiet during the discussion, finally spoke up. "Dr. Blackwood, what exactly are we dealing with here? Are we talking about ghosts, demons, or something else?" "Entirely? Based on the evidence Miss Mitchell has uncovered, we're dealing with a complex supernatural ecosystem that has been carefully maintained for over 3 centuries, Dr. Blackwood replied. "The Wycliffe family didn't just practice occultism. They created a self-sustaining system of power that continues to operate even after the family's apparent extinction." Dr. Chun looked up from her examination of the photographs. If we're going to properly investigate this case, we need to examine the family cemetery. Ritual murder typically involves specific burial practices, and there may be evidence of additional graves or ceremonial sites. Sarah felt a familiar chill at the mention of the cemetery. Thomas mentioned that the groundskeeper reported strange lights coming from the cemetery area before he quit his position. If the rituals are still continuing, that might be where they're taking place. Then that's where we need to go, Dr. Blackwood said decisively. But we'll need to take proper precautions. If the supernatural forces here are as powerful as the evidence suggests, we could be walking into considerable danger. The group spent the next hour preparing for their investigation of the cemetery. Dr. Blackwood produced a collection of protective items from his equipment case, iron crosses, blessed salt, and small mirrors that he claimed could reveal supernatural presences invisible to the naked eye. Dr. Chun assembled her forensic tools, including ground-penetrating radar equipment that could detect buried remains. As they prepared to leave the library, Sarah noticed that the temperature in the room had begun to drop significantly. The others felt it too, their breath beginning to form small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. "They know what we're planning," Dr. Blackwood said quietly. "The entities associated with this place are trying to discourage us from proceeding." The lights in the library began to flicker, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. But these weren't the slow, deliberate steps Sarah had heard before. These were rapid, almost frantic, as if someone was running through the corridors. "Elena," Sarah called out. "Professor Vasquez, is that you?" The footsteps stopped abruptly, and a woman's voice responded from somewhere in the walls themselves. "Don't go to the cemetery. They're waiting for you there. The Keeper, it's stronger now than it's ever been. It feeds on knowledge, on curiosity, on people like us who dig too deep into things that should remain buried." Dr. Blackwood stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "Professor Vasquez, we're here to help. Can you tell us how to break the hold this entity has on you and the others?" "The Covenant," Elena's voice replied, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "It's written in blood and sealed with death. As long as the Wycliffe line continues, the pact remains active. But there's something else, ... something the family never understood. The Keeper doesn't just want offerings. It wants to cross over completely, to manifest permanently in our world." Dr. Chun looked up from her equipment. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means," Dr. Blackwood said grimly, "that we may not just be dealing with a family curse. We may be looking at an attempted demonic invasion that's been building for 3 centuries. The implications of this revelation hung heavy in the air. Sarah realized that her simple historical research project had uncovered something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined, not just evidence of past crimes, but an ongoing supernatural threat that could potentially affect far more people than just the Wycliffe family. "There's one more thing," Elena's voice continued, growing fainter. "The last Wycliffe Mortimer. He didn't die of natural causes. He was trying to break the Covenant, to end the family's involvement with the Keeper. But the entity wouldn't let him go. It killed him and absorbed his soul, just like it did to us." The temperature in the library returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. But Sarah knew that their brief respite was just that, brief. The forces they were dealing with were far more powerful and malevolent than she had initially understood. "We need to examine that cemetery," Dr. Blackwood said, gathering his protective items. "If the Keeper is indeed trying to manifest permanently in our world, there may be evidence of preparation rituals or summoning circles. We need to understand exactly what we're up against before we can hope to stop it." As the group prepared to leave the manor for the cemetery, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But she also knew that they had no choice if they didn't act soon. The Wycliffe family's dark legacy might claim not just their lives, but their souls as well. The real battle for Wycliffe Manor was about to begin. The Wycliffe family cemetery lay hidden behind a grove of ancient oak trees, their gnarled branches forming a natural canopy that blocked most of the afternoon sunlight. As the investigation team approached the wrought iron gates that marked the entrance to the burial ground, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her like a suffocating blanket. The cemetery was larger than she had expected, with dozens of weathered headstones arranged in neat rows that stretched back into the shadows beneath the oak trees. But what immediately caught her attention were the newer additions: fresh flowers, burning candles, and small offerings of food and wine placed on several of the graves, despite the fact that the cemetery had supposedly been abandoned for decades. "Someone's been maintaining these graves," Dr. Chun observed, kneeling beside a headstone marked with the name Ezekiel Wycliffe 169211734. The grave was adorned with black roses and a collection of small bones arranged in intricate patterns. "These offerings are recent, within the last few days." Dr. Blackwood consulted a small device that resembled a compass, but instead of pointing north, its needle spun wildly in all directions. "The electromagnetic readings here are off the charts," he said grimly. "There's definitely supernatural activity in this area, and it's extremely powerful." Thomas Hartwell remained near the cemetery entrance, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "I don't understand how anyone could be maintaining these graves. The manor has been sealed for 30 years, and the only people with access are myself and the researchers I've brought here." Sarah moved deeper into the cemetery, studying the headstones and their dates. The Wycliffe family burial ground told a story of its own: multiple generations of family members who had died young, often under mysterious circumstances. But it was the pattern of deaths that caught her attention. "Look at this," she called to the others, pointing to a cluster of graves near the center of the cemetery. "Every 30 years, there's a spike in deaths within the family. 1724, 1754, 1784. It continues right up to the present day." Dr. Blackwood joined her, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he studied the dates. "These correspond to generational renewal rituals. Every 30 years, the family would have needed to renew their covenant with the keeper, and that would have required significant sacrifices." Dr. Chun had set up her ground-penetrating radar equipment and was scanning the area around the oldest graves. "I'm detecting multiple anomalies," she reported. "There are far more bodies buried here than there are headstones to mark them. Some of these graves contain multiple remains, and there are several areas where the soil has been disturbed recently." As if summoned by their discoveries, a cold wind began to blow through the cemetery, causing the candle flames on the graves to flicker and dance. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Sarah could hear what sounded like whispered conversations coming from the direction of the newer graves. "We're not alone here," Dr. Blackwood said quietly, reaching for one of his protective iron crosses. "The entities associated with this place are becoming active." The whispers grew louder and more distinct, and Sarah realized she could make out individual voices. Some spoke in archaic English, others in languages she didn't recognize, but all carried an undertone of desperate pleading. "They're the victims," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All the people the Wycliffe family sacrificed over the centuries. Their spirits are trapped here." Dr. Chun's radar equipment began emitting a high-pitched whine, and the display screen flickered with interference. "Something's interfering with the electronics," she said, tapping the device. "The readings are becoming completely erratic." That's when they saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows beneath the oak trees at the far end of the cemetery. It was tall and impossibly thin, draped in dark robes that seemed to absorb the light around them. Where its face should have been, there was only a void of absolute darkness, but Sarah could feel its attention focused on their group with malevolent intensity. "The Keeper," Dr. Blackwood breathed, his hand tightening on his protective cross. "Everyone stay together. And whatever you do, don't look directly into its face." The entity began to move toward them with a gliding motion that suggested it wasn't quite touching the ground. As it approached, the whispers from the graves grew louder and more frantic, as if the trapped spirits were trying to warn them of impending danger. "You should not have come here," the Keeper spoke, its voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The covenant is sacred, sealed in blood and bound by death. Those who interfere with the ancient ways must pay the price." Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to run, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "We know what you are," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "We know about the murders, the sacrifices, the innocent people you've killed to maintain your power." The Keeper's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass mixed with the screams of the damned. "Innocent? There are no innocents in this world, only those who serve and those who are consumed." The Wycliffe family understood this truth, and they prospered for centuries under my protection. Dr. Blackwood stepped forward, holding his cross before him like a shield. "Your covenant died with Mortimer Wycliffe. You have no legal claim to this world anymore." "Legal claim?" The Keeper's voice dripped with contempt. "I am beyond your human laws, beyond your mortal understanding. The covenant was written in blood, and blood calls to blood. As long as there are those who seek power, who hunger for dominion over their fellow creatures, there will be those willing to serve me." Dr. Chun had been quietly working with her equipment during the confrontation, and she suddenly looked up with alarm. "The radar is detecting movement beneath our feet," she said urgently. "Something's coming up from underground." The ground around them began to tremble, and Sarah could hear the sound of earth being displaced from multiple directions. The headstones began to shake, and several of the older markers toppled over as the soil beneath them shifted and heaved. "The dead are rising," Thomas Hartwell said in horror, backing toward the cemetery entrance. "We need to get out of here now." But their escape route was blocked as skeletal hands began to emerge from the disturbed earth around the cemetery gates. The remains of the Wycliffe family's victims were clawing their way to the surface, animated by the Keeper's supernatural power and driven by centuries of accumulated rage and suffering. "This is what happens to those who defy me," the Keeper said, its form beginning to solidify and become more substantial. "You will join my collection of researchers, trapped forever in service to the ancient ways." Sarah realized that they were facing the same fate that had befallen Professor Vasquez and the other missing researchers. But as the skeletal figures continued to emerge from their graves, she noticed something that gave her hope. Many of them were not advancing toward the living investigators, but instead were turning toward the Keeper itself. "They're not all under your control," she said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Some of these spirits are fighting back." The Keeper's attention shifted to the rebellious dead, and Sarah could sense its surprise and growing anger. "Impossible. The covenant binds all who die on this ground to my service." But Dr. Blackwood had noticed the same thing Sarah had. "Not all of them died as part of your rituals," he said with growing confidence. "Some of these people were buried here before the Wycliffe family arrived, and others died trying to resist your influence. They're not bound by your covenant." The cemetery had become a supernatural battlefield, with the spirits of the Keeper's victims fighting against the animated remains of those bound to serve it. In the chaos, Sarah saw their chance to escape, but she also realized that running away would only postpone the inevitable confrontation. The Wycliffe family's dark legacy had to be ended once and for all, and that meant finding a way to break the covenant that had given the Keeper its power for over 3 centuries. The battle in the cemetery raged around them as Sarah and her companions found themselves caught between the warring spirits of the dead. The Keeper's bound servants, the skeletal remains of ritual victims, clashed with the rebellious spirits. of those who had died resisting the Wycliffe family's dark influence. The air crackled with supernatural energy, and the very ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with otherworldly power. Dr. Blackwood grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward a large mausoleum at the center of the cemetery. The Wycliffe family crypt, he shouted over the supernatural chaos. If we're going to break the covenant, that's where we'll find the original documents. Dr. Chun and Thomas Hartwell followed close behind, dodging the grasping hands of animated corpses and the ethereal forms of vengeful spirits. The mausoleum was an imposing structure of black granite, its entrance sealed with a heavy iron door, bearing the twisted tree symbol of the Wycliffe family crest. "The door's locked," Thomas said, examining the ancient mechanism. "I don't have a key for this." Dr. Chun stepped forward with a crowbar from her equipment kit. "Sometimes the direct approach is best," she said, wedging the tool into the doorframe. With a grinding screech of protesting metal, the door swung open, revealing a descending staircase that led into absolute darkness. The keeper's voice boomed across the cemetery, filled with rage and frustration. "You cannot escape your fate. The covenant is eternal, sealed in blood and bound by death. Even if you destroy the documents, the pact will endure." But Sarah had been thinking about Elena Vasquez's words from the manor. "The covenant was written in blood," she said as they descended into the crypt. "But what if the blood wasn't just from the victims? What if the Wycliffe family members had to contribute their own blood to seal the pact?" Dr. Blackwood's eyes widened with understanding. "Of course, a covenant of this magnitude would require a genetic component, a blood bond that ties the family line to the supernatural entity. If we can find the original documents and destroy them properly, we might be able to sever that connection." The crypt was larger than they had expected, with multiple chambers branching off from the main corridor. The walls were lined with stone sarcophagi bearing the names of Wycliffe family members dating back to Ezekiel himself. But it was the chamber at the far end that drew their attention. A circular room with walls covered in carved symbols and a stone altar at its center. "This is where they perform the renewal rituals," Dr. Chen said, examining the altar with her flashlight. The stone surface was stained with what appeared to be centuries of dried blood, and the symbols carved into the walls seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. Sarah approached a stone pedestal near the altar, where a collection of ancient documents lay protected under a glass cover. "These are the original covenant papers," she said, her voice filled with awe and revulsion. "The actual contracts signed by each generation of Wycliffes. The documents were written on what appeared to be human skin, with text inscribed in a dark substance that could only be blood. The signatures at the bottom of each page were accompanied by bloody handprints, and Sarah could see that the most recent edition was dated 1994, the year of Mortimer Wycliffe's death. "Look at this," Dr. Blackwood said, pointing to a passage. "In the original document, the covenant includes a termination clause. If the family line dies out completely, or if the documents are destroyed by fire blessed by the innocent dead, the pact can be broken." Thomas Hartwell looked confused. "But the family line did die out with Mortimer. Why is the keeper still active?" Sarah studied the documents more carefully, and her blood ran cold as she realized the truth. "Because the family line didn't die out," she said quietly. "Look at the genealogical records. Mortimer had a daughter, Rebecca Wycliffe, born in 1970. She left Salem when she was 18 and changed her name, but she's still alive." The implications hit them all at once. The keeper's power was still anchored by the existence of a living Wycliffe descendant, and as long as Rebecca lived, the covenant remained active. But there was another possibility, if they could find Rebecca and convince her to renounce the family's dark legacy. They might be able to break the pact from within. "We need to find her," Sarah said urgently. "If Rebecca Wycliffe is still alive, she's the key to ending this nightmare." "But they're Conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stone stairs behind them. The keeper had followed them into the crypt, and its presence filled the chamber with an oppressive darkness that seemed to drain the light from their flashlights. "You understand now," the entity said, its voice echoing off the stone walls. "The covenant cannot be broken by outsiders. Only a true Wycliffe can release me from my bonds, and Rebecca has shown no interest in claiming her inheritance." Dr. Blackwood stepped protectively in front of the others, his iron cross glowing with a faint silver light. "Then we'll find her and convince her to do what's right." The keeper's laughter filled the chamber. "You assume she will choose to help you. But Rebecca Wycliffe has tasted power, just as her ancestors did. She has built a successful life using the gifts I have provided, and she will not willingly give up those advantages." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the full scope of their challenge. Not only did they need to find Rebecca Wycliffe, but they also had to convince her to sacrifice her own supernatural advantages for the greater good. It seemed like an impossible task. But then she remembered something Elena Vasquez had said. The keeper fed on knowledge and curiosity, on people who dug too deep into things that should remain buried. All of the missing researchers had been absorbed into the Manor's supernatural structure because they had discovered the truth about the Wycliffe family. "That's why you've been collecting researchers," Sarah said, understanding dawning in her voice. "You need people who understand the occult, who can help you find ways to strengthen the covenant or break free from its limitations." The keeper's form seemed to solidify further, becoming more human-like, but no less terrifying. "Very perceptive, Miss Mitchell. Yes, I have been gathering those with knowledge of the supernatural arts. Each researcher who discovers my secrets becomes part of my growing power. Their expertise added to my own understanding of how to manipulate the barriers between worlds." Dr. Chun had been quietly examining the ritual chamber while the others confronted the keeper, and she suddenly called out in alarm. "The symbols on the walls, they're not just decorative. They're part of an active summoning circle. This entire chamber is designed to facilitate the keeper's manifestation in our world." Sarah realized that they had walked into a trap. The keeper hadn't just followed them into the crypt, it had lured them here, to the very heart of its power, where it could complete the process of fully manifesting in the physical world. "The final ritual," she breathed. "You're going to use us to complete your crossing over." The keeper's form continued to solidify, becoming more substantial and more terrifying with each passing moment. 4 researchers, each with their own expertise, each with their own connection to the supernatural. Your combined knowledge and life force will provide the final component I need to break free from the limitations of the covenant. But as the entity prepared to complete its transformation, Sarah heard something that gave her hope. The sound of voices calling from the cemetery above. The rebellious spirits, led by Elena Vasquez and the other missing researchers, were fighting their way into the crypt to help them. The battle for the Wycliffe legacy was entering its final phase, and the outcome would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of anyone who might encounter the family's dark influence in the future. The stone walls of the Wycliffe crypt trembled as the spirits of the rebellious dead poured into the ritual chamber, led by the ethereal form of Professor Elena Vasquez. Her ghostly appearance was both beautiful and tragic, a woman frozen at the moment of her death, her academic robes flowing around her like mist, her eyes burning with 30 years of accumulated rage and determination. "You cannot have them," Elena declared, her voice echoing with supernatural authority. "These researchers came here seeking truth, not to become pawns in your ancient game." The keeper's partially manifested form turned toward the invading spirits, its attention momentarily diverted from Sarah and her companions. "You are bound to this place, just as they." The keeper's partially manifested form turned toward the invading spirits, its attention momentarily diverted from Sarah and her companions. "You are bound to this place, just as they will be." Your rebellion changes nothing. The covenant remains unbroken. But Elena was not alone. Behind her came the spirits of Dr. James Whitmore, the researcher who had vanished in 1962, and dozens of other souls who had been trapped by the Wycliffe family's dark practices over the centuries. Their combined presence filled the chamber with a cold, silver light that seemed to push back against the Keeper's oppressive darkness. "The covenant may be unbroken," Dr. Whitmore's spirit said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of supernatural imprisonment, but it was built on lies and murder. "Every soul you've claimed, every life you've destroyed, we remember it all." Sarah realized that this was their chance. While the Keeper was distracted by the spiritual uprising, she grabbed the ancient covenant documents from their protective case. The parchments felt warm to the touch, as if they were alive, and she could feel the malevolent power radiating from the blood-inscribed words. "Dr. Blackwood," she called out, "you said the documents had to be destroyed by fire blessed by the innocent dead. How do we do that?" The professor was already reaching into his equipment bag, pulling out a small vial of what appeared to be ordinary water, holy water blessed by the victims of supernatural violence, he explained quickly. "If we can get the spirits to consecrate a flame with their combined will, it should be enough to break the covenant's power." Dr. Chun had found an old torch mounted on the chamber wall and was working to light it with matches from her kit. "The spirits need to focus their energy on the flame," she said as the torch caught fire. "Can they do that?" Elena Vasquez turned toward them, her ghostly form flickering with determination. "We've been waiting 30 years for this chance," she said. "Every soul trapped in this place will lend their power to break these chains." The Keeper realized what they were attempting and let out a roar of rage that shook the entire crypt. "You cannot destroy what was written in blood and sealed with death. The covenant is eternal." But as the spirits of the innocent dead began to gather around the torch, their combined will focusing on the flame, something extraordinary happened. The fire began to burn with a pure silver light that seemed to cleanse the very air around it. The oppressive darkness that had filled the chamber began to retreat, and the carved symbols on the walls started to crack and crumble. "Now," Dr. Blackwood shouted, "burn the documents now." Sarah thrust the ancient parchments into the blessed flame, and the reaction was immediate and violent. The documents didn't simply burn, they screamed, releasing centuries of trapped anguish and malevolent power in a cacophony of supernatural sound that threatened to shatter their eardrums. The Keeper's form began to waver and lose cohesion as the covenant that had bound it to the physical world for over 3 centuries started to unravel. "This is not possible," it shrieked, its voice becoming more distant and ethereal. "The blood bond cannot be broken by outsiders." But Elena Vasquez stepped forward, her spirit form blazing with righteous fury. "We're not outsiders," she declared. "We're the victims of your covenant, the innocent blood that was spilled to seal your pact. Our deaths give us the right to break what was built on our suffering." As the last of the covenant documents crumbled to ash in the blessed flame, the Keeper's form began to dissolve completely. The entity that had terrorized Salem for centuries was finally being banished back to whatever dark realm it had originally inhabited. "This is not over," the Keeper's fading voice echoed through the chamber. "As long as there are those who hunger for power, who are willing to sacrifice others for their own gain, I will find a way to return." But its threats were empty now. Without the blood covenant to anchor it to the physical world, the Keeper was powerless to maintain its presence. The entity faded away like smoke, leaving behind only the lingering scent of sulfur and the memory of its malevolent presence. The change in the crypt was immediate and profound. The oppressive darkness lifted, the temperature returned to normal, and the carved symbols on the walls cracked and fell away, revealing ordinary stone beneath. Altar that had been stained with centuries of blood was now clean, as if it had been newly carved. "It's over," Thomas Hartwell said in amazement, his voice barely above a whisper. "The covenant is actually broken." But Sarah noticed that not all of the spirits were fading away. Elena Vasquez and several of the other researchers remained, their forms becoming more solid and peaceful as the supernatural bonds that had trapped them were finally severed. "We're free," Elena said, her voice filled with wonder and relief. "After all these years, we're finally free to move on." Dr. Whitmore's spirit approached Sarah, his expression grateful but urgent. "The knowledge we've gained during our imprisonment, it needs to be preserved. There are other families like the Wycliffes, other covenants that still exist. The work of documenting and stopping these supernatural threats must continue." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I understand. This won't be forgotten or covered up. The world needs to know what happened here." One by one, the spirits of the trapped researchers began to fade away, finally able to find peace after decades of supernatural imprisonment. Elena was the last to go, pausing to look back at Sarah and her companions. "Thank you," she said simply. "You've given us something we thought we'd lost forever, the chance to rest." As the last of the spirits disappeared, the four living researchers found themselves alone in the now ordinary stone chamber. The supernatural threat that had plagued Wycliffe Manor for over 3 centuries was finally ended, but Sarah knew that their work was far from over. They climbed the stairs out of the crypt and emerged into the cemetery, where the first rays of dawn were breaking through the oak trees. The graves were peaceful now, no longer disturbed by supernatural forces, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the burial ground was completely gone. "What happens now?" Dr. Chun asked as they walked back toward the manor. Sarah looked back at the Wycliffe family cemetery, where generations of victims and perpetrators lay at rest for the first time in centuries. "Now we document everything," she said firmly. "We make sure the world knows what happened here, and we use this knowledge to identify and stop other supernatural threats before they can claim more victims." Dr. Blackwood nodded in agreement. The Keeper was right about one thing. As long as there are people willing to sacrifice others for power, there will be entities ready to exploit that weakness. But now we know how to fight back. As they reached Wycliffe Manor, Sarah realized that her simple historical research project had become something much more significant. She had not only uncovered the truth about one family's dark legacy, but she had also helped break a supernatural threat that had persisted for over 3 centuries. The Wycliffe family's macabre history was finally at an end, but the lessons learned from their downfall would help protect future generations from similar fates. The dead could finally rest in peace, and the living could move forward with the knowledge that even the most ancient and powerful supernatural threats could be overcome through courage, determination, and the combined will of those who refused to let evil triumph. The manor stood silent in the morning light, no longer a prison for trapped souls or a gateway for malevolent entities. It was simply an old building with a dark history, a history that would be remembered, documented, and used to ensure that such horrors never again took root in the world of the living.